Hi guys, and welcome to everybody's favorite video of the year. At least I think it is, but for me personally it's also one of the most dreaded ones because I'm so bad at picking favorites. But I like to film this video anyway, just because it gives me an opportunity to highlight some of the best and my most favorite books of the year a little bit more, or in some cases, some of the books that I'm going to talk about in this video I haven't mentioned on this channel at all so far. So I have made a list of my best and therefore favorite books that I read in 2020. It's not a countdown, it's not in order from least favorite to most favorite, it's not a top 10 either. They are in some sort of order though. I've grouped them roughly by genre, and I'm going to start with two crime novels. The first one is The Lost Man by Jane Harper. This is a murder mystery that's set on a cattle station in the Australian outback in Queensland, where the station owner is found dead from exposure far out on his land in the desert. It's not a police procedural, and the police treat the death as a tragic accident, but the dead man's younger brother is not so sure. And it's funny, even though it takes place in the Australian outback, it still very much feels like a locked room mystery because the setting is so isolated and there's only a very small number of people who could have been involved in the death, in the murder, if it was a murder. And it is just amazing how the author conveys this atmosphere of oppressive isolation, an isolation that is stifling and can make you feel downright claustrophobic, even though there is wide open spaces and infinite horizons all around. The book also deals with a lot of broader societal issues in these isolated small farming communities, and it is extremely interesting in this way. It's hands down one of the best crime novels that I've ever read. My second crime novel is a classic police procedural about a serial killer case in London. It's Bitter Legacy by Datt Maclean, which I've only just talked about in my last video. This is romantic suspense, and it is 100% the main character, who is a young detective in the Metropolitan Police, whose story arc and character arc will rip your heart out, as will that of his love interest. It's a dramatic case of circumstances combined with people standing in the way of their own happiness, and it is extremely stressful and heartbreaking, but also so rewarding, at least if you like big emotions. My next book could be classified as crime as well, but I would rather put it in the general fiction category, and that is No Country for Old Men by Cormac McCarthy. This is set in a Texas border town in the 1980s, where a man who is out hunting comes across a murder scene in the desert. It's a drug deal gone wrong, all the men are dead, but there is a suitcase full of money, millions of dollars still in the boot of the car, and it's enough money that the man, who is trailer park poor, takes it, even though he knows very well that from that moment on until the end of his life there will be a target on the back of his head, and people on both sides of the border are going to hunt him, and the police on top of that. And that is exactly what happens, only nobody has counted with a psychopathic bounty hunter who outsmarts all other hunting parties. However, in the center of the story is actually the sheriff in whose area of jurisdiction the original murder, the drug deal clusterfuck, took place. And it's really his story. At the beginning of each chapter is a monologue by the sheriff or by an older contemporary version of him. And in these monologues he reflects on the case and on how things had changed from the time of his youth, and also how things have changed since then. And this is really the story of one man trying to make sense of the world around him, a world which, in his eyes, seems to get increasingly more irrational and more unexplainable and more irrationally brutal. It's extremely poignant because all these thoughts that he has are so universal and universally relatable. It's a little bit comical as well because as a sheriff in a Texan border town, he has a somewhat limited and biased perspective, but on the whole, still so relatable. This can make you quite anxious about the state of the world, this relatableness, but I think this universality is also oddly comforting. My next book I would classify as general fiction as well, and it is contemporary, at least for the time when it was written in 1996. It's The Return of John Macnab by Andrew Greig, and this is obviously a retelling of John Macnab by John Buchan, which is the story of a poacher who issues a public challenge claiming that he will be able to poach a salmon, a grouse, and a deer from 3 different Highland estates. And in this retelling, a group of friends reissue this challenge and then go through with it in order to shine a light on the problematic nature of the system of land ownership in the Scottish Highlands. I love the setting, I love the topic or the cause or this social issue, and Andrew Greig is a fantastic writer. I knew that before I picked up the book, and the setting and the characters come across so vividly. Unfortunately, the only major female character in the book was a major manic pixie dream girl adult edition. If not for that, the book would have been a perfect read for me. My next book is a volume of short stories, Winter Count by Beryl Lopez. This is a very small volume of very short stories about man's relationship with nature. It is subtly magical and subtly and quietly affecting. Beryl Lopez is such a big name. He is the author of Arctic Dreams, among other titles, but this is the first thing that I ever read by him. But now I can't wait to get into Arctic Dreams. And then I have 2 historical novels. One is The Lie by Helen Dunmore, and this is the story of a young man who returns from World War I. He comes back to Cornwall even though he has no life there anymore. His mother, his only surviving relative, died in his absence, and he has no home, no inheritance, not even a circle of friends or any social network to return to. But he returns there anyway because he figures that it's better than sleeping on the streets of London. And his hometown is also the last remaining connection to his best friend, whom he lost in the trenches and who was the one single most meaningful relationship in his young life. The protagonist, who is also the first person narrator, lives very much in the past. He is clearly traumatized and constantly relives that one most awful day in the trenches when he lost his friend. And he also dwells on this relationship and the development of it, and particularly on all the things that he thinks went wrong or he could have done differently and how he failed his friend. And it is, again, an extremely poignant thing to read, because I think the reader's judgment of this man's character and his actions, both in the war and before, differs very much from his own in places. And as the story of a young man who returns home from the Great War traumatized, it is at once an extremely personal story and a sadly universal one. And then there is Master Georgie by Beryl Bainbridge. This is the story of a group of for the most part, rather eccentric people around a wealthy young man, Master Georgie. And this group more or less accidentally stumbles into the Crimean War without a very good idea of what they are getting themselves into and what is even happening all around them. It is comical and tragic, and it just shows so very well the limited perspective that ordinary people have, and especially that they had in this day and age when information wasn't so readily available. And next I have a little bit of fantasy. I read considerably less fantasy in 2020 than I usually do, and almost none of it was classic secondary world fantasy. Piranesi by Susanna Clarke isn't even really fantasy at all, it's more speculative fiction. And that is almost as much as I want to say about it here. I certainly do not want to say more than I did in that very short, mostly spoiler-free review video that I did a few weeks ago, or a couple of months ago by this point. But I enjoyed this book so much because it is essentially a play with Platonic philosophy and the philosophical and occultist traditions that were developed from it. And as such, it is not just original, but also refreshingly understated. And I enjoyed this original play with the tradition so much. And The Faerie, Hounds of York by Arden Powell is a novella that, as you might guess, is set in Yorkshire on the North York moors in the Georgian or early Victorian era. It is a folk horror story about a man who is under a fairy curse and is in danger of being sucked into the Fae realm. And in the beginning, at least, he has no idea who is doing that or why, and of what interest he might be to the fairies. He gets help in the form of a mysterious stranger who has his own reasons for fighting Fae curses and for following the spooky, deadly fairy hounds of the title with their ominous howling. The spooky and frosty atmosphere of the North York moors in autumn and winter in this novella is just outstanding. It's the perfect read for a cozy winter night. And then, as you may have noticed if you followed me for a while, I read a lot of romances in 2020. Really went down a deep dark rabbit hole there. So for the grand finale of this video, I have 5 romances, or really rather 4.5, I'd say. My first one is a historical romance. It's the only historical romance in this video and also the only one that I have enjoyed this year. It's Whistling in the Dark by Tamara and it's set in 1919 in New York. It's just before the beginning of the Prohibition and just at the beginning of the Jazz Age. This is the story of 2 young men who have returned from the war not very long ago, and one of them has recently found the resolve to break with his small-town life in a small Midwestern town where there didn't seem to be a future for him outside the family business because a wartime injury cut his career as a piano player short. So now he has basically run off to New York City with only a few cents to his name and is literally rescued off the streets by the other young man. He is struggling as well. He was orphaned during the war, and he is now struggling to keep his small family business afloat, a novelty shop, and he's also struggling to cut a niche out for him as a radio show host. And a piano virtuoso, even a handicapped one, is a gift from heaven in this situation, and the 2 of them are good for each other and complement each other in other ways as well. It's just a very sweet story with very sweet characters, bittersweet from time to time, and just very rich, evocative, lyrical writing. It's just all around gorgeous. And Mended with Gold by Lee Welch is a contemporary novella set in New Zealand, in a small coastal town near Wellington, where a photographer has moved to recuperate after a traumatizing event that happened during one of his documentary shooting expeditions. And in the aftermath of this event, he has also come to question his superficial lifestyle and social circle in London, so he has taken himself out of all of this. And there in this small town, he develops a friendship with one of his neighbors who intrigues him, but also frustrates him and puzzles him because he seems so full of contradictions and his behavior seems unexplainable at times and erratic, and sometimes it seems authentically quirky and eccentric, but can you really be sure that it isn't just an act, etc., etc. So just the way it is when you meet new people. What struck me most about this novella is how perfectly it shows this slow process from projecting onto somebody whom you've only just met to getting to really know them and getting to understand their actions and behavior and their quirks and the reasons for them. I thought it was remarkably realistic and insightful. There is a lot of that too in Division Bells by Iona Datt Sharma. This novella is set in the environment of the British Parliament, where a minister's team are trying to get a bill passed in the House of Lords. And a temporary special advisor for the issue at hand, wind farming, disrupts the comfortable routine of the rather rigidly minded and workaholic civil servant who's been working with the minister and in this position for a long time and is rather set in his ways. So this definitely follows the opposites attract trope, and it's a little bit of enemies to lovers too, and all this in this extremely interesting workplace setting. It's the perfect mixture of hard politics or hard administrative procedure and sweetness, and the writing style is fresh and original and just a touch lyrical. Just perfect little read. And next I have a book which has definitely made it onto my favorite books of all time list, and that is Glitterland by Alexis Hall. This is the story of a man who has bipolar disorder and suffers quite badly from it. And unfortunately, he is not the easiest person to like, at least if you have to live with him. I rather liked him right away, I have to say, but he is quite posh. He has an Oxbridge education, and on the one hand he is quite alienated from that and all the trappings of class that come with it and the classism that often comes with it. Yet on the other hand, it is also his education is also a source of great pride to him. And this contradiction exacerbates his self-loathing, and it also throws him off his game completely when it is beginning to look like what he needs most in his life is a little TLC from an orange wannabe fashion model from Essex who was supposed to be no more than a one-night stand. This book is told in the first person, and it is extremely cleverly done how the author has his narrator consistently paint not only himself but also his love interest in the worst possible colors, yet after a while the reader is able to see through this as a defense mechanism. I'm going to talk a bit more about this book in an author spotlight about Alexis Hall that I have planned for the foreseeable future, but for now let me just say that this is one of the most heartbreaking books that I've read this year, and it had me crying crocodile tears at 3 in the morning. And my last book is also by Alexis Hall, who is one of my new favorite authors, and the book is Prosperity. This often gets categorized as romance, but I'm not so sure about this classification. I mean, yes, there is a lot of doomed love in the book and a lot of desire and yearning, but it's not a straight-up romance. It is a steampunk adventure that is set in a mining town in the sky. The town sits on metal contraptions that are hooked to the skies, and in this town they are mining a resource that is used as fuel or refined into fuel, much like oil. And it is the story of a group of people who are all of them rather shady, who come together more or less by accident on a skyship and set out to mine a pocket of that fuel stuff. Even though there have been rumors of calamities and possible sky krakens in the direction in which they are going. The best thing about this book is the voice of the first-person narrator, who has made his way up into the sky from the slums, and he very much still talks in hardcore street slang, turn of the century street slang, consistently throughout the book. I know this isn't everybody's thing, but for me, this linguistic inventiveness and linguistic plays like that are just about one of the best things that can be found in a novel. So Prosperity has definitely been one of my outstanding reads of 2020 and maybe of recent years in general, although recency bias might still be at work here. We shall see. So these were my favorite, best, most remarkable, most outstanding reading experiences of 2020. I would love to know if you have read any of them, what you thought about them, and what some of your best, most favorite books of 2020 were. I wish you a good ending to 2020, a good beginning to 2021. Guten Rutsch, as we say in Germany. I'll see you on the other side. Bye.